saw the light, came to Australia and joined the RAAF, where he moved through the system flying Mackeys, C-130s, Caribous, DC-3s. He's been a weapons instructor, a photographic officer, and retired, and he now works at the RAAF Museum. He's very much involved in it. The Royal Aeronautical Society, he's involved in that, and he is also a director of Mill Point Rotary, so he's a busy man, and he's got a very interesting wife, and I'm sure you'll hear more about her as time goes on. So Ken's going to be talking about Imperial War Graves Commission, in which he and his wife are involved. So over to you, Ken.
Right, if someone had said 6 months ago you're going to give a presentation on the Imperial War Museum, I'd have thought they'd had a few screws loose. As it turns out, my wife is an Air Force legal officer. She was in the Permanent Air Force for 9 years, and she's been in reserve for another 25. And she recently retired as a wing commander, but they won't let her retire. They still wanted to stay in the system. But unbeknownst, she got appointed as warden of the Imperial War Graves Commission, and which I knew nothing about. I've had very little involvement with certainly graves and those sort of things. So I started to waiting for Chris to take over the job. I'd better find out what's going on, because sure enough, she's the dignitary. She's the one that introduces all the heavies, and I'm just a handbag that carries her backward and forward. But, these dignitaries don't know too much. At just one point on finding that DC-3, I was based up at Townsville for quite some while, and between Townsville, Cairns, Cooktown, Iron Range, top of the Cape and back around the other side of Whitby, 129 aircraft went missing during the Second World War. So I would imagine there'll be a few more of those that will be picked up over the years. But anyway, okay, the Imperial War Graves Commission, the whole concept of finding the dead was founded by this chap, Sir Fabian Ware. He obviously wasn't knighted initially, and he was a chap that as soon as the First World War erupted, put his hand up to volunteer for the Australian Army, British Army. And but of course he was 45 years of age, so they wouldn't let him in, and he was determined to get involved in some way, so he put his hand up for the Red Cross. And then because of his involvement with Rio Tinto, he's had a fair bit of influence finance-wise. He was involved in supplying vehicles for looking after the injured and the ambulance hospital side of things. And as soon as they got involved in that, they realised that there were so many people getting killed at such a rapid rate, unbelievable numbers of dying. And those of you, know more about the First World War than I do, but the line would move forward and the line would move back, the line would move forward and the line would move back. And of course, each of as the casualties got caught up each time, then their graves were, if there were graves, were destroyed by more bombing as the line moved backwards and forwards. And as a result, they started to keep lists of where they were finding all these bits and pieces. It started off as the Imperial War Graves Commission, and then that's in 1915 where the concept started, and then officially formed by the Army into the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1917, and then it became the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in 1960. As I say, Sir Fabian Ware, or Fabian Ware in those days, was too old to join. He volunteers for the Red Cross. As a result of vehicles, they form a voluntary mobile Red Cross ambulance unit, and it was known as the Flying Unit. One of my grandfathers, I had two grandfathers in the First World War, one of them was an ambulance driver, and when he came back he finished up being a London transport driver for 46 years, but when he was an ambulance driver, and of course one never discussed anything about the wartime with relatives, and certainly was in the people of I knew, and certainly my parents. I had two grandparents in the First World War, father was in the Second World War, my son's been in the Iraq, Afghanistan type stuff, but no one discussed it. But one thing that my grandfather described was the horror of having to drive an ambulance to go across to pick up the injured and driving across the dead bodies and hearing the bones crack. And I've never forgot that sort of comment. So you can imagine it's obviously a horrendous type of situation. Anyway, the Commonwealth War Graves was set up because so many people were killed. There was no record of where they had gone. They didn't have a grave. Because of the warfare moving backwards and forwards, graves got destroyed. They didn't have time to bury people. Mass graves, and so there were so many husbands, wives, mothers, fathers. Where's my son? Where's all the records? Where can I, remember that my poor fallen relatives? And as a result, the army was only too happy for Ware to take on the task, so he sort of moved away from the ambulance type role to actually keeping records of where there were graves and where there were bodies, etc. So the casualties were horrendous. I mean, within months, within almost weeks of the war first starting, 4,300 graves were recorded in May 1915 alone. The graves were not identified. Many bodies were missing. They didn't have graves. They didn't know where they'd gone. Bits and pieces of them all over the place. And bodies are still being found today. And in fact, on average, 30 every year are being found. Rudyard Kipling, he was involved in establishing of the the commission itself. But his son had a bad eyesight, I think the problem was. Anyway, Rudyard convinced the system to allow him to join up in the army, and needless to say, he died. 70 years after he died, they discovered his body, obviously with modern day technology and DNAs and the like. So by November 1918, there were 1.7 million Commonwealth dead. And these are the sort of numbers we've got to look at. It's unbelievable. France, 1.398 million. Russia, 1.8. Germany, 2. Austria-Hungary, who were part of the Germans, another 1.1. Italy, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. The total number is just horrendous. And needless to say, the army just was more concentrated on fighting the war than they were on looking after answers to relatives, etc., of various personnel. And not only did we have, the best part of 10 million people dying from actual conflict, there's more died from the flu epidemic, which, because of the way masses of people were moved around, is why the flu epidemic became particularly bad. And as I say, more died than were actually killed in the system itself. Okay, when we get to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission itself, the present-day president is Prince Edward, Duke of York, and each of the board members are the High Commissioners for these countries. So each of these look after the administration, the cost. Its headquarters in Maidenhead in London, but each of the commissioners for the various countries that are involved in paying for their share of the running costs. Now these figures could well be 2 or 3 years old, but as you can see, £70 million and it's £85 per grave, and that's the sort of costs involved. Pro rata graves, i.e., in other words, the number of dead is the proportion you paid of the share of the cost of, etc. So the UK is 78%, Australia only 6%. Now these are the number of graves that there are not in the world completely, but I mean this is the bulk of them. As you can see, there's 1.7 million graves in 2,500 cemeteries in 154 different countries. And today it has a staff of 1,300, of which 850 of them are gardeners. And that might sound a bit strange, but one of the philosophies of setting up the graves for the Commission was that they had to be peaceful and attractive, if you can have a sort of thing for a grave. Whereas when you see the German ones, they're black and morbid, etc. But we'll look at photographs of those shortly. Even in Ypres alone, there's a number of separate graves that there are. That's only about 30 miles by 30 miles. So there's all this men in Messines, Passendale, Langemarck, Pomeranian and Ballieu, and it's just unbelievable the amount of stuff. I was over there for the Rugby World Cup a couple of years ago, and in between the games my wife and I went across to this area. We actually hired a house in Ypres and went on a couple of tours, and they're still finding piles of bullets and hand grenades and goodness knows what. And as we're driving down the street, there's a pile of what I said were stones, and I said to the guy, "What are these?" He said, "Oh, don't worry," he said, "they're mortars, they've got to be picked up." Now mustard bombs, they look like rugby balls. The Belgians have got the official mustard bomb unit for whatever they could do to get rid of them. They have got, if they don't find another bomb, they have got enough bombs. It's going to take them 35 years to get rid of them. That's the mustard bombs. So you can imagine they're going to find more and more stuff. These are the sort of graves that are on the Imperial Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and we'll talk about the numbers shortly, but the sizes of them, what's allowed to be inscribed on them, the size of the graves, the flowers, the fences, the whole box of dice. It's all quite criterion. And this is just typical of the War Graves Commission all over the world. Most of them are, as you've seen before, those stone memorial graves, but sometimes when the ground is not suitable, then they have little plaques on the ground there, but they are individual ones, so the single names on them. Whereas when you look at a German one, you'll see that it's many names on each of the stones. And that basically is because no one wanted to give the Germans any land to bury their people in those days, so they had to make them as mass graves. So, I mean, the First World War, it was the first time that anyone had bothered to look after the dead and the graves, and which was something I found quite extraordinary. But then, the more I investigated, the opposite became. Crimean War, 1853. So we're talking about 60 years before. 13,000 were killed in action. 20,000 died from wounds, because obviously the medical treatment was nowhere near as good as it is today. So if anyone got injured, relatively minor injury, the chances of dying from some sort of a disease or infection was extremely high. So, the number that got killed in action was infinitely less than died overall. In 1856, there were 139 cemeteries for the dead that are involved in the Crimean War. Right, 20 years later, only 11. And then another 10 years, there was one left. There's nothing today. No one's done anything about it. So most graves were dug, mass graves, and they had to be because of disease. You didn't have all the facilities to look after individuals and take them away, and especially with the way warfare was, so you had mass graves, which were the norm. And not only that, most of the people that were mercenaries or soldiers, they were the scum of the earth sort of thing. They weren't particularly admired or whatnot, and the only people that really got looked after were officers, or people that had money people. In fact, many people were paid. I think the officer ranks used to have to pay to get their commissions in the armed services. So the masses of troops that got killed, no one was particularly interested in them in any case. And most soldiers were, as I say, undesirable individuals, that not that I'm saying the Irish were, but I mean, a lot of the Irish joined the British Armed Forces even though they couldn't stand the British, because they wanted jobs, and that was the only reason they joined. The very few war graves survived due to plundering by grave robbers or by vandals or even grazing animals. Okay, so most were dug quickly, which was essential to avoid diseases. Society was not interested. Most soldiers were undesirable, and very few graves survived by the plundering by robbers or vandals, even grazing animals, etc. And no nation was specifically allocated to look after. Nothing was organised. So, even going back to the Napoleonic Wars, right, 1800, 1815, I mean, the casualties, 310,000 killed in action, and that 800,000 died from disease, because there was no medical facilities to look after them at all. I don't even know whether they had any doctors in their units then. No graves are recorded, no cemeteries are recorded, plenty of mass graves, but whereabouts are unknown. And this is where they're still finding them today, researching on the Napoleon's part, the mass graves, and that's the only sort of records, but there's nothing officially there. There's no names, there's no connection, nothing. Now this is a lot of the troops that don't have any graves, male or female, they're recorded in, there's 55,000 names, it might be 57, but 50,000 names are in this Menin Gate, right? And that was built entirely to remember people who there are no known graves for. Now, as I said, I was over there a couple of years ago for the Rugby World Cup. I have never been to Menin before, so then when my wife and I were there, we went on several tours, and we're actually in this concept. And what it is, every night since 1927, except for the 4 or 5 years of the Second World War, they played the last post, right? So you get there, they close the road off about 7:45. A historian reads out, some kids lay some poppies on the graves, and a historian reads out some information about one of the 50 odd thousand names that are there, and then they play the last post. Right? We're there for 2 nights. The second night, what did they do? Lieutenant Pittman. I don't believe this, and and needless to say, I got quite emotional about it. But as it turned out, I'm P-I-T-T-M-A-N and this guy was P-I-1-T-M-A-N. But I mean, I didn't know that at the time, and I still can't get over the fact that I have never been there before. There's 50 odd thousand to choose from, and they went to pick the same surname. So now the state war memorial that we've got here at Kings Park is a replica of the Australian Imperial Force memorials in France and Belgium. And they all come in with certain criteria. And our one is particularly attractive because it overlooks the cities, the Swan River and Darling Ranges. It's probably the most attractive cenotaph set up in the world. So within the one here that my wife is now the warden for, are the crypt and the names of 7,000 World War I West Australian casualties. On the outside, the names of another 4,000 World War II casualties, and in the vaults are the names of WA casualties of any other wars that involved, including the latest ones. In addition, there are over 50 other memorials in the park. It's quite extraordinary, the Kings Park, 50 separate memorials. They're not all war memorials, but there are 50 memorials, and of course there are 1,000 odd plaques that are by the trees, and those of you that have driven around Kings Park or running or walking, whatever the case may be, have seen those. Now this is Her Ladyship performing one of the ceremonies. What happens, the warden is appointed every 12 months, and it's a military person, Army, Navy, Air Force, and in between are civilians. And as I say, Christine, for some reason, my wife, was selected this year, and so she has to do about 50 of these parades, ceremonies each year. And needless to say, the Dawn Parade is the most significant one, and that's Her Ladyship. Give the present. And then no sooner the week after she got this situation, and we had a disaster at home. She was up in the loft helping me clear out some rubbish, and she trod on a part of the roof that wasn't reinforced, crashed through the ceiling of the carport onto the bonnet of my car, bashed against walls, and now she's walking around with her leg all strapped up. But just as well she did for it, because if she had fallen from this height, so you've actually fallen straight and down, she could have done unbelievable damage to her spine, etc. So anyway, bashed off my car, bashed off the board, and then onto the floor again. Anyway, that's another story. That's the Kings Park itself, and these are the 50 odd separate memorials. They're not all military, but by far the majority of them. The actual wardens, they're the guys that you'll see them, old guys, well, when I say old guys of our sort of age that march around looking after the various functions, are sub-wardens, and they're all part of the RSL Club of Highgate. And these are the sort of roles that they look after, replacing of these parts, making sure they're looked after. Very, very little damage is done to the memorials, the plaques etc. up there. But, when you think of the graffiti and the vandalism there's around, well, there's very little damage done to the stuff up at Kings Park. But they maintain the plaques, and they supply deputy wardens to attend every wreath laying ceremony. These chaps down here, they're the ones that to put the flags up, put it down. So they're from Highgate RSL. Just as a matter of the RSL, after the Dawn Parade, which was 4 o'clock in the morning that we had to get there, so the Dawn Parade, and then we went to the RSL in Adelaide Terrace for breakfast at 9 o'clock, and then there was a march past at 11 o'clock. The first thing they did when we got to the RSL for breakfast was spent the first 10 minutes reading out all the names that passed away since the previous 12 months of breakfast. And I thought, well, this is exciting. This is the RSL mission. Obviously the ones over in the eastern state, there's a few black marks on some of the things that they're up to. But the idea is that the RSL is supposed to look after they've agreed to look after the estate. Now when it comes to the Whitehall one in London, the Whitehall, and I was born in London, Lower Tooting to be exact, 1943, I have never been to one of these ceremonies. In fact, I can hardly even remember going to Whitehall, let alone to go. And this is the sketches that were made of the cenotaph that is now in Whitehall. It was not going to be permanent. It was made out of plasterboard and a timber frame, etc. And it was not going to be used after the first ceremony in 1919. But it was so successful that it's been made out of stone. Now, I'm not absolutely sure whether that is the Tempe one or not. I couldn't quite get any, I couldn't get any definition of which year that these things were. Just as a matter of fact, the cenotaph itself means an empty tomb. This is what goes on today, and this is what's at Kings Park, which is based very much on what's actually been constructed in Europe. And there's the plaques and names on the back and the vaults, etc. And at the back of behind the cenotaph is this plaque here, which is, and it sort of simulates the Gallipoli climbing up from the water up to the base there, and it says ANZAC BLUFF. This bluff below the State War Memorial is dedicated to the men of the ANZACs who fought and died in the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. It resembles Ari Burnu, where ANZAC stormed the beaches, brought forward and shared previous losses with the valiant foe. Now this is some of the 50-odd memorials that are actually at Kings Park. This is Lord Sir John Forrest. He was the first leader of WA, and he's the one that set up the park. So there's different memorials from the Women's Forces, for firefighters, you name it. We go to 2nd, 16th, South African Memorial, Vietnam, Kokoda. There's, as I say, it's quite extraordinary that there are so many of them at Kings Park alone. There's none other in the world has got as many as we've got at our park. The Vinnerbrook tragedy, the one down the bottom here, that's the one where all those nurses were executed by the Japanese. Tragic story. Right, the Commonwealth Graves Commission at Karrakatta, one of the criteria for the graves for the what was initially the Imperial and the Commonwealth War Graves was the fact that no one got brought back to England, right, or their country of origin, because they decided it was only just because you could afford to bring your family back, right, and you couldn't, so that the criteria, no one comes back. All your gravestones are exactly the same size, etc., etc. Then I thought, well, hang on, how come all this stuff's in Karrakatta? And then, of course, as soon as you look at it, there are 498 graves in the World War I to 16, World War II 477, Vietnam 5. They came back here as injured troops, and they died whilst they were here. So that's why they were remembered in the park here. The grave construction rules are regardless of rank, and this was all decided back in 1917. All will have the same size gravestone. Each regiment can add an emblem and detail on the stone to be rank, name, regiment and date of birth and approved family message. Every cemetery to have 2 monuments, every cemetery to have a shelter, every cemetery to have flowers, shrubs and a level grave, and every cemetery to have a fenced boundary. Every cemetery to have a printed register, and these buried in isolated graves are to be transferred with the cooperation of the French. All the land basically was bought from the French, well, not all, but I mean initially it was bought from the French and on a peppercorn rent, and on the understanding that the Allied forces would maintain the graves, etc. The decision to not bring anyone back, there was quite a lot of argument about that. Anyway, Winston Churchill was involved in that, and it got debated in Parliament, and then refused to have a vote on it, because I think if they had a vote on it, then it would have been overruled. But anyway, Winston Churchill had his way, and no one was allowed to come back. I do believe one senior officer came back, but no one else did. And all this information is available, so if you've got any relative or whatever the case may be, then you can get on the internet and you can search all this stuff. And it's the only system that operates like this. So once the grave is found, the grave is opened and the body is recovered. It's fairly common sense what's going on. They're looking for identity disc, pay books and any papers. Just out of interest, I was flying caribous up in Papua New Guinea in Wewak. We landed one day, and the guy that was looking after the base said, "What happened the other week, boss?" I said, "No." They found an American Marauder 2-engine bomber just off the runway in Wewak, and the remains of the 2 pilots were still in the cockpit, less than 50 metres off the airfield. The remains of the 2 pilots were still sitting in the cockpit, and the dog tags were hanging around their skeletons. So that was 1975, I think it was, around about then. So and they pranged in 1943. So needless to say, we got hold of the dog tags and we informed the Americans, and they came back and said, thank you, but we don't want to know, we buried them already. So in other words, they misidentified two people back in 1943, and they didn't want to sort of stir the pot by, letting them know what's going on. So, having found bodies, then they are wrapped in a blanket and sewn up, body marked with identification tag. Bodies are then transferred to one of the associated war grave cemeteries, and the details are added to the register, which everybody has access to, And the bodies from World War I are still being found today. In fact, as I say, Rudyard Kipling's son was found 70 years after he died. The number of dead, the numbers are just incomprehensible, but this is some of the criteria which I found quite extraordinary. Marching 4 abreast past the cenotaph, it would take 84 hours or 3.5 days for all to pass, right? That's equivalent to a distance from Quebec to Ottawa, Melbourne to Canberra, Bloemfontein to Pretoria, or Lahore to Durban. Can you imagine it? Just a number of all those people. It's just phenomenal, the numbers that got killed in the First World War. This is 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. As a kid, I can remember, I was born in 43, I can remember everything stopped at 11 o'clock, traffic lights went red, everything froze sort of thing, Now this was a parade the other day, the dawn parade, and at 11 o'clock, and this the president of RAFA and the RSL, RAFA guy on the left hand side, Richardson and councillors on the RSL. Standing behind Chris is the head warden. He's the one that coordinates everything, and Chris is the one that introduces each of the people, goes and meets the governor and walks her down to the parade itself. This was a Rhodesian group that were having a memorial service. It's a sub-warrant who escorted the bagpipes. It was quite funny because one of the parades there, the big sort of concrete arc remembrance, and I was down where the flagpole is, and the bagpipes man was about as far away as you are from me, sort of thing, And I've got tinnitus from flying aircraft. Well, I tell you what, if you stand behind a man playing the bagpipes that close to him, you think, God almighty, how come that any of them got any hearing left? And the funny thing was, there was a couple of dogs down on the ground and extremely well behaved, quite under control, big Dalmatians of it. And the moment the bagpipes started playing, well, they just went bananas. They had to track them away. And the other thing is, at the dawn service, I'm sitting here in the front row, as I say, I'm just a handbag, and I'm watching these Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts walking back and forth. I thought, what's going on here? Every dawn parade, the Scout Rovers, all right, because the architect at Hobbs, Sir Talbot Hobbs, I think it was, when he was not only the designer of the cenotaph, but he was also the head of the Scout troop, so he got the Scouts looking after the memorial that night, and then the wardens take over first thing in the morning. As I say, there's my dear lady giving a presentation. The German War Graves Commission, they're nowhere near as well organised as ours. Needless to say, once the war was over, no one wanted to sell them land. All right, so what land they did get had to be mass graves, and each of their cemeteries, they're little stones that are about as big as an A4 sheet of paper, and they've got about 20 names on each of them. They're all mass graves, and they're dark and they're dour, and we'll see some photographs in a minute. But even those, so they got formed in 1919, a private organisation, it's not government run, etc. 832 cemeteries, 2.6 million casualties, and 8,000 volunteers, so, and they're in 45 different countries. And these are the German type plaques, and each of those plates would have quite a number of names on, and they're very dark and black marble sort of thing. They're very. Where's the War Graves Commission ones? By criteria, they've got to have flowers in, they've got to have lawn, and they've got to be a certain size and part apart. They're almost like an English garden. The Americans have also got a system called ABMC, American Battle Monuments Commission. And it was established in 1923. They've got 24 cemeteries in 16 countries, but it is amazing the number of people that they do not have records of. For example, I'll just read out this. Thousands of American military graves lie forgotten and lost aboard. We don't know how many Americans who died while serving during wartime are buried on foreign soil.
Why? For one, there isn't a single organisation that tracks the burials. There is no database of every American service member buried overseas. Some are buried in former memorial cemeteries, others in private cemeteries, mass graves and isolated burial sites. Old records have been lost and new burials have been discovered. Women were not counted among the war dead. Thousands of Americans fought under foreign flags before the US entered the World War, and they're buried as foreigners. And those missing in action are lost at sea, further complicated tracking, and some have simply been lost. Burial sites in Canada where 200 American casualties from the War of 1812 had been buried, apparently forgotten. 300 or 400 Americans fought for the French Foreign Legion with great distinction in World War I. 24 Americans are buried in World War II cemeteries in Belgium. None have any notation of their gravestone that they're American. You could be looking at the gravestone and think they're British or Canadian. And that's today. And one thing I heard, the Americans have been more thorough about picking up the dead from Vietnam than any other nationality in any other country, but here we have all this previous stuff that there is no record of. This is an American cemetery. I mean, what cemeteries are, very solemn and gracious, etc. But the mere fact is they don't have the records that we have got. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.